He didn't shout. He didn't protest. He didn't call for security. He just stayed in his seat. But what happened next would shake the aviation industry to its core. Nathaniel Cross, a calm, composed CEO of a billion-dollar investment firm, boarded a flight like any other. A first-class seat, a business trip, nothing out of the ordinary. Until a flight attendant walked up and said 6 quiet words that would change everything. "Sir, I think you're in error." Was it a mistake or something more? Why was his seat reassigned while a white passenger took his place? What did the airline not know about Nathaniel that would soon turn their world upside down? And why did one quiet man become a symbol of systemic change without ever raising his voice? This is more than a story about a seat. It's about dignity, power, and what happens when a man refuses to be erased. So, if you're ready for a story that will move you, challenge you, and stay with you, like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because this journey is just about to take off. The Madrid airport was quiet that morning, hushed by the soft blue of pre-dawn and the rhythmic rolling of luggage wheels over polished stone floors. Terminal 4 was sleek, all steel beams and filtered sunlight. Nathaniel Cross moved through it with practiced calm. He walked alone. No entourage, no bodyguards, just a single leather carry-on and the kind of presence that didn't require noise to command space. His stride was unhurried, but every step carried precision. Nathaniel was a man who had spent more time on planes than in boardrooms, even though he ran one of the largest capital firms in the Western Hemisphere, Croswell Capital, a name whispered in acquisition halls and emerging markets. He was its architect and its face. 46 years old, 6 feet tall, dark-skinned, sharp-jawed. His navy travel suit fit like it was built on his bones. Understated, intentional. Every inch of him said, "I've been here before." He wasn't flying commercial because he had to. He did it because he liked to keep his finger on the pulse of the real world. That morning, Flight 881 would take him to Chicago, his home base, and the heart of a pending infrastructure deal that could shift transit policies in 4 Midwestern states. As he approached the sky-high airlines gate, a quiet chime echoed. The boarding process had just begun. Nathaniel tapped his phone. Seat 1A as always, not because of ego, because of function, privacy, space, silence, and, truthfully, a clause in his firm's investment contract with sky-high seat 1A preference guaranteed when available. Tied to shareholder tier, he was no regular frequent flyer. He was a 17% equity stakeholder. Still, he never flashed credentials. He didn't have to. At the boarding lane, the scanner pinged green. The agent smiled politely. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Cross." He offered a small nod, his eyes already scanning the jet bridge ahead. Familiar, predictable, until it wasn't inside the plane. The first-class cabin glowed in that soft amber that always made luxury feel intimate. Fresh linen on the tray tables, the scent of citrus and leather. Nathaniel slid his carry-on into the overhead bin above 1A. His seat. Always. He sat, settled in, crossed one leg over the other, pulled out his tablet. Market updates. Currency shifts. Chicago's commuter bond pricing. He barely noticed the footsteps until they stopped right beside him. A pause, then a voice. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move." Nathaniel didn't look up right away. He thought it might be a mistake, or turbulence prep. He glanced up slowly. She stood rigid in her uniform. Amanda Crowley, senior flight attendant, sky-high blue blazer, platinum wings pinned perfectly. Her blonde hair was pulled tight in a bun so severe it looked like a command. Nathaniel held her gaze for a moment. Calm, measured. "I'm sorry," he said. "There seems to have been a seating error," Amanda said, her tone clipped. "This seat is assigned to another passenger." Nathaniel blinked once. "I believe that's incorrect," he replied quietly. He turned his tablet around. The boarding pass glowed clearly. Nathaniel Cross, seat 1A. Amanda glanced briefly, but didn't read it. Her eyes flicked from the tablet to his face, then to his hands. His suit, a full-body scan disguised as formality. "Regardless," she said, "we're going to need you to relocate to a seat further back. It's still premium. Row 5. Nathaniel didn't move. There was no escalation in his voice, no surprise, just the tightening of silence. "I'm not moving," he said softly. "I was assigned this seat. I am entitled to it. If there's confusion, I'd be happy for you to verify in your system." Amanda's face didn't change, but something sharpened in her eyes. "There's nothing to verify," she said. "The system has been adjusted. Please comply, sir." Nathaniel tilted his head. Adjusted. He had seen it before. The polite tone wrapped around exclusion, the subtle refusal to acknowledge evidence, the weight of 1,000 moments that said, "This isn't for you," without needing to say it at all. She was speaking with authority, not facts. He opened his mouth to respond, but paused. Something in the air shifted. The passenger in 1B, a man in a gray suit, was now watching. Row 2 had fallen quiet. Nathaniel turned his tablet back toward himself and locked the screen. "I'm afraid I won't be moving," he said again. "You may check with your cabin manager." Amanda's smile was slight but sour. "Very well," she said. She turned on her heel, heels clicking crisply against the cabin floor. Nathaniel exhaled, slow, not angry, just tired. It was happening again. He looked out the window, at the gray dawn light now creeping across the tarmac. He didn't expect this flight to be dramatic. He expected coffee and emails and silence. Now it was becoming something else. It wasn't about the seat. It never was. Moments later, Amanda returned. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man, 50s, tall, white, with a headset slung over his collar and a badge clipped to his blazer. "Mr. Cross?" he asked with rehearsed professionalism. "I'm Ron Barrett. I understand there's been an issue." Nathaniel nodded. Still seated. "No issue. Just a misunderstanding. This is my assigned seat." Ron motioned vaguely toward Amanda. There was a last-minute change. "Seat 1A is needed for a priority guest. We're happy to relocate you to row 5. Extra legroom, champagne on the house." Nathaniel's brow tightened. Slowly, deliberately. He stood. He wasn't tall for intimidation. He was tall for truth. He looked Ron in the eye. "My name is Nathaniel Cross. I'm not just a passenger. I'm an investor. 17% of this airline belongs to my firm." Ron hesitated. "I have a contract that guarantees this seat." Another pause. Nathaniel leaned slightly forward, voice low but sharp. "If there's been a change in policy, I suggest you document it. Because what's happening here, it's not just a seating error. It's a reflection." The cabin was watching now. Phones hovered discreetly. And from somewhere in row 3, a quiet camera clicked on. The cabin of Flight 881 had shifted. A subtle ripple moved through first class. Passengers who had been adjusting headphones and sipping espresso now watched over the tops of tablets. The quiet tension wasn't loud. It didn't shout, but it filled the space between every seat. Nathaniel Cross stood calmly in front of seat 1A. His frame still, his voice measured. Across from him, Ron Barrett's confidence was beginning to crack, not visibly, not yet, but in the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, in the way his eyes briefly darted toward Amanda Crowley, then toward the hovering stairs behind him. "Mr. Cross," Ron began again. Slower this time. "I understand your frustration, but we're in the process of pre-boarding a diplomatic guest who was assigned Seat 1A due to security clearance and protocol." Nathaniel didn't blink. "Show me the manifest." Ron hesitated. "The system is undergoing a refresh, and we're unable to access the full manifest in real time." "But I assure you," Nathaniel raised a single finger. "That's enough." His voice was quiet, almost too quiet, but it had an effect like glass being set firmly on a marble countertop. Deliberate, final. He gestured slightly toward the screen on his phone. "You have a digital record. You have an assigned seat map. You have a profile attached to my name with clear flagging that was added per contract." He paused, letting the silence speak. "You're not dealing with confusion. You're dealing with disregard." Amanda folded her arms, posture stiff. Ron's face flushed. His authority, so easily asserted with most passengers, wasn't landing here. Not with this man, not with this tone. Nathaniel exhaled through his nose and sat back down in 1A. There was no arrogance in the gesture, just certainty. His body moved with the comfort of someone returning to what was already his. Ron opened his mouth, then closed it. He leaned down slightly, lowered his voice to a hush. "Sir, if you don't comply, I may be forced to have you removed from the aircraft. I don't want to escalate this." Nathaniel tilted his head, just slightly. A slow, unreadable gesture. Not anger, not amusement. Something in between. Escalation, he repeated softly. That word had followed him for decades, through meetings where his ideas were dismissed until spoken by someone else, through quiet dinners where clients assumed he was security, not the owner, through years of earning access that others received by default. "I am not being difficult," he said, voice level. "I am not shouting. I am not threatening. I am simply not moving." Ron stood upright. Amanda stepped forward again, her hand hovering slightly near Nathaniel's elbow. "Sir," she began. "Don't," Nathaniel interrupted. There was no force in the word, but it stopped her instantly. He looked at her, not through her, at her. "I am well within my rights. I am in my seat. If you choose to remove me, it will be your choice, not mine. But I am not going to help you do it." Amanda froze. She hadn't expected that. Neither had Ron. Nathaniel didn't speak again. He just turned toward the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, stretching gold across the tarmac. The jet engines purred in their idle state. The jetway hadn't yet pulled away. He rested his wrist on the armrest. His heart was beating, but not fast, just heavy. A weight he had carried before. He didn't want drama, didn't want spectacle. He had a day's worth of negotiations waiting in Chicago, but this was one of those moments that stood between principle and submission, and he knew exactly which side he belonged on. Row 3 was completely silent now. The man in 3D, who had been scrolling through sports headlines, now held his phone upright. A tiny red light blinked quietly. Recording. Another passenger, a woman in 2B, whispered to her husband. Her voice was barely audible. "This is ridiculous," she murmured. "He's calm. He's in the right—" Ron was beginning to sweat. The air conditioning hadn't changed, but the social temperature had. Still, the manager was used to these situations ending with compliance, with quiet passengers backing down, embarrassed, not with this, not with composure that felt like resistance. He stepped back. "I'll consult the captain," he said abruptly. "Please remain here." Nathaniel didn't answer. He didn't nod. He simply continued looking out the window. Amanda stayed for a moment longer, then pivoted and followed Ron through the galley curtain. As they disappeared, Nathaniel finally allowed his shoulders to shift, just slightly. The moment was catching up to him. Not because he was afraid, because he hated that it was happening again. He hadn't asked for the seat out of pride. He wasn't flaunting anything. This was built into the system, but even systems had loopholes, especially when they were filtered through human perception. The truth was, he could have emailed someone, pulled strings, dropped names, but every time he did that, it reinforced the lie that you had to be somebody for fairness to apply. And that wasn't the future he wanted to fund. His thoughts were interrupted by a presence beside him. A woman had stepped into the cabin, older, elegant, white, dressed in a dove-gray pantsuit with pearl earrings and a vintage clutch. Her hair was silver blonde, curled softly at her shoulders. She looked at Nathaniel as though he were an unexpected object in a familiar painting. She glanced at 1A, then back at him. "Excuse me," she said, "is this seat taken?" Nathaniel didn't answer, because behind her, Amanda reappeared, and her expression said everything. This was the passenger. This was why. No security clearance, no diplomat, just someone else, someone expected, someone who fit. Amanda didn't speak. She simply gave a polite gesture toward the seat, an unspoken instruction for Nathaniel to rise, and for a long, heavy second, he didn't. The woman waited. Nathaniel slowly stood, not for them, for himself. He reached into the overhead bin, pulled down his leather carry-on, and stepped back, without a word. He didn't look at Amanda. He didn't look at Ron, who now lingered in the galley shadows. He walked down the aisle, toward the front exit. The cabin watched him go. No one spoke. But the silence said it all. Nathaniel hadn't made it 5 steps down the aisle before it happened. A firm hand gripped his upper arm, just above the elbow. Not rough, but not gentle, either. He stopped. Amanda Crowley's voice came next, just over his shoulder. Cool, controlled, practiced. "Sir, please remain here. We haven't cleared the procedure yet." Her fingers tightened. Nathaniel turned his head slowly. Her hand was still on his arm. His voice, when it came, was low. "You need to remove your hand." Amanda hesitated, her grip loosened, but she didn't let go. "I'm simply asking you to comply with crew instructions." "I was complying," he said. "I was leaving." The moment hung in mid-air. A thin rope pulled between tension and control. Amanda finally released him. Nathaniel stepped back, placing a few feet of space between them. His eyes met hers for a brief second. Not angry, not pleading, but clear. Amanda looked away. Behind them, passengers were silent. Still. Some were pretending to look out their windows. Others stared straight ahead, hoping not to get involved. But several weren't pretending at all. A man in row 3 now had both elbows rested on his tray table, phone pointed with deliberate steadiness. The little red light blinked steadily. Nathaniel saw him. He nodded once, and then he walked. Down the aisle, past the rows of seats that once welcomed him without question, back through the curtain that separated comfort from the common. Every step echoed like a reminder. He didn't carry rage in his stride. He carried clarity. At the front of the aircraft, just past the jet bridge threshold, a ground agent stood waiting. He didn't ask questions, just gestured toward the terminal. Nathaniel stepped off the plane. The door behind him closed with a hush, and the gate fell into silence. He took a breath. It tasted sterile. Recycled air, filtered through commercial ventilation and corporate indifference. There was no crowd, no protest, no shouting, just a quiet space where something irreversible had just occurred. Nathaniel spotted an empty seat in the corner of the gate area. Metal frame, faux leather, one of those chairs that offered form, but no rest. He sat, placing his carry-on by his feet. He didn't check his phone, didn't open his tablet. He just sat. He closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered his father's voice. Years ago. Back when Nathaniel was barely 20 and had been kicked out of a networking dinner he was invited to because someone assumed he was part of the catering staff. Son, you don't need to fight every battle, but you better make sure the ones you pick leave a mark. Nathaniel breathed out through his nose. Slow. Even. This wasn't a moment of humiliation. It was a moment of illumination. Back on the plane. Amanda returned to the first-class cabin. Her steps were brisk. Her expression tightened into professionalism, though a flush of heat crept across her cheekbones. Margaret Ellison, now comfortably seated in 1A, adjusted the recline on her seat. She glanced up as Amanda passed. "Everything all right?" Amanda nodded. "Just a passenger mix-up. It's been resolved." Margaret offered a small smile. "That's good. I was worried it would delay departure." Row 2 overheard. The woman who had whispered to her husband earlier looked out the window, jaw clenched. In row 3, the man with the phone was still recording. He leaned toward his screen and began to type, "Guess who just got removed from seat 1A for not looking the part? Sky-high discrimination or Crosswell Capital corporate bias." He hit post, then he opened TikTok, uploaded the raw clip, no edits, just truth. Nathaniel Cross being confronted, showing his boarding pass, staying calm, being escorted out, then an elderly white woman taking his place. The contrast was enough. Within minutes, the clip began to circulate. Not viral, not yet, but fast. The comments started pouring in. "Wait, is that Nathaniel Cross, the CEO? No way, they just kicked him out of first class. I need the full story now. The algorithms, always hungry for outrage, took note. The clip began trending. On board the plane. The final boarding call sounded. The aircraft door was sealed. Margaret Ellison leaned back in her seat, flipping through a luxury art catalog she'd brought on board. Her pearls glinted in the overhead light. She took a small sip of champagne. She turned to the woman across the aisle and spoke in a tone meant to be overheard. "They should have told me he was someone important. He didn't look like it." The woman in 2B stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her husband placed a hand on hers. She leaned over and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. He was important before she knew who he was. That's the problem. Meanwhile, in the terminal. Nathaniel still hadn't moved. He wasn't planning anything dramatic. He wasn't calling the press. He wasn't live-streaming his anger. He was thinking, remembering, calculating. He had submitted a proposal to Sky High Airlines over a year ago, a system-wide protocol to reduce incidents of unconscious bias during seating disputes and customer interactions. He had called it the Bias Override Protocol. It was clean, simple, smart, but it was shelved. Too complicated, they said, too bureaucratic, not aligned with our core demographic. Nathaniel had let it go. For a while. Now he sat in silence, watching the gate crew shuffle about, unaware of what had just unfolded 10 feet away from them. He wondered if anyone on the plane had started posting, if the spark had caught yet. But even if it hadn't, it would. Moments like this always did. They lived in the small moments, in the tension between facts and feelings, in the places where appearances outweighed policies. He reached down, unzipped his carry-on, and retrieved a red folder, thin, sleek, stamped with the discreet gold emblem of Crosswell Capital. Inside was a single document, the Bias Override Protocol. He placed it gently on his lap and waited. The executive lounge was quiet, almost sterile, insulated from the chaos of the terminal just outside its frosted glass walls. Muted jazz hummed through invisible speakers. Soft leather chairs sat in perfect formation, too stiff to be called comfortable, but too expensive to question. Nathaniel Cross chose the one in the far corner, beneath a framed photograph of a snowy mountain range. The irony wasn't lost on him. Stillness, distance, control. He sat slowly, setting the red folder on the side table like it was made of glass. He didn't rush. There was no need. The world would do the running for him now. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, past the champagne bar and chrome espresso machine, toward the runway. In the distance, Flight 881 had already begun taxiing. It would lift off soon, slicing through the morning sky, carrying with it the illusion of professionalism. Nathaniel didn't feel humiliated. He felt resolved. He hadn't been looking for a fight. He had boarded that plane prepared to work. He had deadlines to meet, calls to take, a deal to finalize by dinner. But the seat wasn't just about location. It was a symbol, one that meant more than comfort. It meant recognition. He pulled out his phone. Dozens of notifications stared back at him. He didn't open them. Not yet. Instead, he opened the Notes app, created a new entry, began to write. He started with one word, pattern. It had happened before. Not always in first class. Sometimes in meetings. Sometimes at restaurants. In boardrooms where someone assumed he was the assistant. On conference calls where people addressed his junior staff instead of him. It was a subtle erosion, not enough to destroy you all at once, just enough to wear you down over time. And this time, it had a camera. He paused, fingers hovering above the screen. Nathaniel knew better than most how public sentiment worked. The internet had no memory for nuance. It reacted fast, forgave slow, and moved on even faster. But this moment wasn't just a fluke. It was an inflection point. He opened his bag and pulled out a sleek black USB drive, placing it beside the red folder. He had brought it for another reason, a presentation for a separate investor meeting. But now its contents would serve something bigger. On that drive was every document, every email thread, every proposed policy. A trail that led back to Sky High Airlines' rejection of the bias override protocol. A quiet paper trail of decisions made behind closed doors. Too much effort, too much red tape, too few problems to justify the cost. He smiled slightly, though it wasn't amusement. It was recognition. They had said there was no measurable ROI in building a safeguard for something they didn't think would happen. Now it had happened. And the return on that ignorance was about to be calculated in real time. A quiet chime pulled him from thought. Across the lounge, the frosted glass door hissed open. A young woman entered, tablet in hand. Her uniform was tailored but modest. Nervous energy surrounded her like static. She spotted him immediately and crossed the room. Mr. Cross. Nathaniel looked up. She stood straight, eyes bright but cautious. Her name tag read Isabel Tran. I'm with the Sky High operations team. Mr. Barrett asked me to speak with you. Nathaniel said nothing, but motioned for her to sit. Isabel hesitated, then lowered herself into the seat across from him. She placed her tablet gently on the table. First, let me just say I'm very sorry for what happened on the flight. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow slightly. You're not the one who needs to apologize. I know. I saw the alert come through the system. Then I saw your name. She paused, and I recognized it. Nathaniel studied her face, not accusing, just curious. Recognized it from where her fingers moved over the tablet, bringing up a screen. She turned it toward him. Internal profiles. Investor class tiers, flags and notes. There it was, Nathaniel Cross. Tier Black Platinum. Priority 1A access guaranteed on all flights per executive agreement. She tapped the note attached to his name. It's literally coded into the system, she said. You should have been unmovable. He leaned back, eyes never leaving hers. And yet I was moved. Isabel's throat tightened. She glanced down. There was a moment of silence between them, thick with something unspoken. Finally, she asked, "Did you want to rebook?" "No," Nathaniel said. "I want you to deliver a message." She nodded, readying her stylus. "Not for me, for Mr. Barrett, and for your CEO, Dean Whitmore." He reached over and tapped the red folder gently. "Deliver this." Her hand froze. "And this," he added, placing the USB on top. "This is what they ignored. This is what could have prevented all of this." Isabel didn't reach for the folder yet. She looked at it like it might burn her. I think I've seen the name. Bias Override Protocol. Right. You've seen it once. During onboarding, it was part of a training module that got shelved. I thought it was just a draft. It was a solution. He said it plainly, but they weren't looking for solutions because they didn't see a problem. She stared at him for a long moment, her hands clenched slightly around the tablet's edges. "They will now," she said quietly. Nathaniel gave her a nod, a signal that their conversation was over. Isabel stood, picked up the folder, and drive. Then she turned to go, but hesitated. "Can I ask you something you just did?" She allowed herself a small, apologetic smile. "Why didn't you fight harder on the plane?" Nathaniel looked toward the window again. "Because I've learned something, Miss Tran. Sometimes silence makes more noise." She said nothing more. She left the lounge, the red folder clutched to her chest like a secret. And Nathaniel sat back in his chair, the hum of the airport around him fading into something softer. He didn't need to shout. The world was already starting to listen. The executive offices of Sky High Airlines sat on the 43rd floor of a steel and glass tower in downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around a space designed to feel untouchable. Cream walls. Modern art. A view that said nothing bad ever happened up here. Dean Whitmore stood with his hands in his pockets, gazing out at the skyline. His back was straight, jaw tight. The morning headlines hadn't reached him yet, but a tremor had. A ripple in the system. He could feel it. Ron Barrett entered the boardroom without knocking. His face was flushed and his collar was loose. "Dean, we have a situation." Dean turned slowly. Define situation. Ron exhaled, a deep, reluctant breath. Nathaniel Cross was removed from first class this morning. Dean frowned. Removed, yes. Seat 1A was reassigned due to a manifest error. Dean's brow furrowed. That's not possible. His profile is locked. He's Tier 1. Priority flagged in the system. Ron nodded. We know. But Amanda said there was a high-profile guest boarding, and Amanda the flight attendant. Yes. Dean raised an eyebrow. Arms still folded. You let a flight attendant override a Tier Black Platinum seating assignment for one of our largest shareholders. Ron swallowed. There was silence. Dean walked to the table and pulled out his phone. There were already 3 missed calls from PR, and a message from an unfamiliar number. This video is circulating. You may want to get ahead of it. He clicked the link. The video played without sound. Nathaniel Cross, calm, holding his boarding pass, quietly refusing to move, Amanda gesturing, Ron standing behind her, the removal. Dean's jaw tensed. He looked up at Ron. This is bad. Ron didn't argue. It gets worse. A knock came at the boardroom door. Isabel Tran stepped in quietly, holding the red folder to her chest like it might collapse in her hands. Dean looked at her with a flicker of confusion. "Who are you, Isabel, sir?" "Tech operations." She stepped forward, placed the red folder and USB drive on the table. "Mr. Cross asked me to deliver this, said you'd know what it was." Dean opened the folder slowly. The gold emblem of Crosswell Capital shimmered under the ceiling light. Inside was a copy of the bias override protocol. He flipped through the first few pages. Audit trail logs, proposed training framework, real-time flagging methods to prevent discriminatory seating overrides. It was clean, surgical, elegant. He remembered it immediately. He remembered rejecting it. Too expensive, he had said. Too political. Let HR handle it. Ron leaned over his shoulder. "He's playing chess, isn't he?" Dean didn't answer. Isabel looked between them, hesitating before speaking again. He didn't ask for a press statement or a refund. He just asked that I deliver it. Said silence makes more noise. Dean closed the folder slowly. His mind was already moving. What he wanted now was containment. "Ron," he said, "go to legal. Prepare a statement. Say it was an isolated error. Stress our commitment to all customers, nothing specific. And you," he turned to Isabel, "say nothing to anyone. You didn't see this. You didn't talk to him." "Clear." Isabel looked stunned. "Sir, the video is already out. People are commenting. The engagement is exploding." Dean stared at her. "Did I ask if it was viral?" She blinked. "No, sir." "Then get back to work." Isabel turned, her cheeks burning. She didn't speak again. She left the room quietly, the glass door sliding shut behind her. Dean dropped into the leather chair at the head of the table. He ran his hands over his face. Nathaniel Cross wasn't just another shareholder. He was smart, patient, calculated, and, worse, respected. If he had gone public with this, it meant something was coming. And the problem wasn't just optics. It was data. Sky High had rejected the protocol, put it in writing. There were emails, signatures, audits, and now a single incident had put it all under a microscope. He picked up the USB drive, holding it between two fingers. He didn't need to plug it in. He knew what was on it. The original pitch deck, the bias reports, the list of rejected amendments, a pattern of refusal, all tied to his own internal memos. No measurable ROI, not aligned with strategic image, risk of overcorrecting. He set the drive down like it was radioactive. Nathaniel had walked off that plane without raising his voice. He hadn't shouted, hadn't called reporters, hadn't pulled strings. He just let the system show itself. And now the story was doing all the work. Dean looked at Ron. "We need to get ahead of this. Call marketing. Get me a list of partners who can vouch for our diversity record." Ron nodded and left. Dean remained alone, his reflection staring back at him from the window. He had underestimated silence. It didn't just echo. It spread. Back in the tech wing of Sky High's headquarters, Isabel sat at her desk, eyes fixed on her screen. The video now had over 3 million views, hundreds of thousands of shares. People weren't just outraged, they were organizing. A trending hashtag had emerged. "Martyr's Seat 1A belongs." Comment after comment poured in. He stayed calm. That's what makes this so damning. You could see it on her face. She didn't think he belonged. Sky High just made a billion-dollar mistake. Isabel opened a private note and began typing. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't record it himself. He just sat there and made them look in the mirror. She hit save. Then she stared at the red folder still on her desk. She hadn't returned it to records. She didn't think she would. Isabel Tran sat alone in the dim glow of her second monitor, long after most of her department had left for lunch. The office hummed quietly, a faint buzzing of fluorescent lights and the occasional printer spitting out schedules no one would read. But she wasn't focused on any of that. She had pulled up the core access logs of Sky High's passenger management system. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, hesitating. She wasn't supposed to be in this part of the system. Technically, this kind of access required clearance 2 levels above her. But she had learned early in her internship that most doors stayed locked only for people who didn't know how to ask the right questions. She took a breath. Then she typed, "Bias override, XML." Enter nothing. She refined the search. Passenger flag protocol, enter. A file popped up, dormant, unused. She clicked it open. Lines of code, markers, metadata, and then she saw it. A toggle switch embedded into the back-end logic. Protocol disabled by default. It had been installed, implemented, then quietly turned off. She blinked. This wasn't just a proposal sitting in a dusty folder. This was a functioning patch that had been buried. The bias override protocol had been real. It had lived inside the system, and someone had made the decision to deactivate it after installation. She dug deeper. The timestamps led back to 8 months ago. One name appeared on the approval log, D. Whitmore. Her stomach dropped slightly. She scrolled down the list of logs. Over 230 seating overrides had taken place since the patch had been disabled. 37 flagged incidents involving high-tier passengers. 16 of those involved customers of color. She exhaled slowly. This was no longer about one man and one seat. This was a pattern, a digital fingerprint, and it had a name attached. She minimized the window and sat back in her chair. What now? She could forward it to legal. They'd bury it before it ever saw sunlight. HR would sanitize it, spin it into compliance lingo, and say, "We're looking into it." Or she could send it to someone else. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. A single message from a number she didn't recognize. "I don't believe in coincidence. You still have the folder." There was no name, but she knew. It was Nathaniel. She stared at the message. Her fingers hovered, then typed back, "I found something. Something real." Seconds later, a reply came through. "Then the question is, what are you going to do with it?" She swallowed. Across the city, Nathaniel Cross stood at the edge of a rooftop terrace, hands in his pockets, looking out over the lake. The wind pressed gently against his suit jacket. He had a meeting in 20 minutes, but he wasn't thinking about numbers. He was thinking about Isabel. She had looked nervous when she approached him at the lounge, but she'd held his gaze. That meant something. He had given her the red folder not as a trap, but as a signal. If someone inside still had a conscience, they'd act. And now, it seemed someone had... He didn't want revenge. He didn't need apologies. He wanted the system to change, not with promises, but with consequence. He pulled out his phone and typed one more message. "If you can send me screenshots, I'll do the rest. But only if you're sure." Back at the Sky High office, Isabel stared at the message. She minimized the program, pulled up Snip Tool, and began capturing images, line by line, timestamp by timestamp. She saved each one into a locked folder. Then she zipped it, encrypted it, sent it. 30 seconds later, her screen showed a confirmation message, "File sent successfully." And just like that, her heart began to pound. She had done it. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew the truth was no longer hidden. That evening, Nathaniel sat at his dining room table, alone, with the lights dimmed low. A single candle flickered beside his laptop. He opened the zipped file, reviewed every screenshot. His expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. This was more than leverage. It was evidence. He opened a blank email to Colleen, McAdams' ledger post. Com, subject internal bias protocol suppression at Sky High Airlines. He paused. Then he wrote, Dear Colleen, I trust you remember our conversation in D.C. about systemic discrimination embedded in modern corporate infrastructure. Attached is the first piece of something I've watched grow quietly for years. It's time someone took a closer look. No anonymous tips, no leaks, just a man in seat 1A. Sincerely, Nathaniel Cross. He attached the zipped file, hovered over the send button, then clicked. The candle flame flickered once, and the truth left the room. By the time the sun rose over the Chicago skyline the next morning, the fire had already begun to spread. It started with a tweet from a verified account belonging to Colleen McAdams, senior reporter at the Ledger-Post, known for her investigative pieces on corporate misconduct and whistleblower cases. The tweet was simple. Sky High Airlines quietly disabled a protocol designed to prevent racial bias in seating assignments. They were warned, they ignored it. Now it's public. Story dropping at 8 a.m. Seat 1A belongs. Nathaniel Cross. 15 minutes later, she posted a link. Inside the system, Sky High buried a passenger removed, a protocol ignored, and the code that could have stopped it. Within the hour, the story had been shared over 600,000 times. Nathaniel's name was trending across all major platforms. The video from the flight, the calm confrontation, the removal, the replacement had now reached over 14 million views. Reactions poured in. Politicians, celebrities, former passengers, quiet employees now emboldened. Sky High's brand team scrambled to release a statement. Sky High Airlines is reviewing the unfortunate incident that occurred on Flight 881 and reaffirms its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We take all concerns seriously and are conducting a full internal audit. But it was too late. The comment section wasn't buying it. You had the protocol. You turned it off. He didn't yell. He didn't resist. And you still removed him. This isn't about one man. This is about the system he exposed. Dean Whitmore stood in his office, blinds half closed, the morning light streaking across his desk in harsh lines. His phone was buzzing. His inbox was overflowing. PR had sent over a draft apology, but he hadn't signed it yet. Legal was advising silence. The board was demanding answers. He stared at the printed article now sitting on his desk. Nathaniel's name in bold, the screenshots Isabel had sent, the emails, the deactivation logs, his own signature on the override decision. He rubbed his temple, jaw clenched. He had underestimated Nathaniel. No, he had dismissed him. The man hadn't even raised his voice, and yet the world was roaring on his behalf, across the city. Nathaniel sat quietly in the back of a small cafe in Bronzeville. No bodyguards. No press entourage, just him, a coffee, and a quiet sense of gravity in his chest. The barista had recognized him, gave him his drink for free. You handled that with grace, sir, she'd whispered. He hadn't responded, just nodded gently. He didn't want a spotlight, he wanted awareness. He opened his laptop, scrolling through the article again. Colleen had done it justice. She hadn't sensationalized. She had simply laid out the facts, the protocol, the override, the pattern of removals, all meticulously documented. She had even included a closing quote from him. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for the system to remember what it promised. He sipped his coffee and closed the screen. Across from him, a voice broke the silence. Mr. Cross. He looked up. It was a woman in her 30s, nervous, holding the hand of a young girl beside her. I'm sorry to bother you, my daughter. She recognized you from the news. She asked if we could just say thank you. The girl stepped forward, shy but determined. Are you the man from seat 1? Nathaniel smiled softly. Yes, I am. The girl nodded, wide-eyed. You didn't yell. You just stayed calm. My teacher says that takes more strength. Nathaniel's smile deepened, quiet and proud. Your teacher's very wise. The girl beamed. Then her mother spoke again. You reminded people that it's okay to stand firm even when you're being pushed. Nathaniel nodded. Sometimes that's the only way anything changes. They thanked him again and left, leaving behind something deeper than gratitude, a seed of solidarity. That afternoon, Sky High's board called an emergency meeting. The room was tense. Legal teams, PR advisors, investors on video call. Dean sat at the head of the table, tie loosened, sleep-deprived, but defiant. They want my resignation, don't they? The board chair didn't respond. She didn't have to. The damage is containable. Dean continued, we'll issue a full apology, reinstate the protocol, reach out to Cross, offer a public partnership, let him save face, let us save ours. One of the investors spoke up. He doesn't want a partnership. Then, what does he want? A woman from HR, quiet until now, answered. He wants to know someone was watching, that someone noticed. He wants the next person not to have to be him. Dean said nothing. For the first time in his career, he didn't have a counter, no angle, no clever spin, only the sound of a man's silence echoing louder than any PR campaign he could write. Later that night, Isabel Tran opened her inbox to find a single message from Nathaniel. You did something brave. You should be proud. If you ever need a place where that courage is valued, you know where to find me. Attached was a job offer. Crosswell Capital Associate Director, Ethics in AI Systems. She smiled. She didn't know if she'd take it yet, but it was the first time she felt seen for more than just what she knew, but for what she chose to do. Buried deep within the archived servers of Sky High Airlines was a folder that hadn't been touched in months. It lived in a subdirectory labeled D&I Committee, Dormant Proposals, hidden behind layers of permissions and long since marked inactive. But one person knew where to find it. Isabel Tran sat in her cubicle, earbuds in, though no music played. She didn't want conversation. She wanted clarity. She searched the archived threads using keywords that had grown familiar: bias override, Crosswell, protocol, Nathaniel. Dozens of email strings appeared. She began reading. The first was from nearly a year ago. Nathaniel Cross had sent a formal follow-up to Sky High's Internal Diversity Board after presenting the bias override protocol during a closed-door strategic roundtable. It had been respectful, thorough, persuasive. Attached was a pilot program proposal. The next email was from Dean Whitmore. He had replied to the committee chair with terse finality. While I appreciate the intent, implementing this protocol opens a door we may not be able to close. We risk highlighting a problem we have no evidence exists. Let's not overdo the inclusion stuff. The words stung on the screen. Let's not overdo the inclusion stuff. Isabel's chest tightened. She kept reading. In another message, a junior analyst raised concerns about potential liability if incidents occurred after the protocol was deactivated. We'll cross that bridge when it burns, Dean had replied. She sat back. She knew what this was. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a cover-up with timestamps. She copied the entire thread, encrypted it, and stored it in a secure folder. Then she composed an email of her own. To Colleen, McAdams, a Ledger Post. Subject internal correspondence. Bias override deactivation. She wrote only one sentence. Some bridges were already burning. She attached the file and hit send. That afternoon, Colleen published a follow-up piece. Sky High knew, they just didn't care. Screenshots of the internal emails were embedded in the article. Dean's words were quoted in bold. Let's not overdo the inclusion stuff. We'll cross that bridge when it burns." It didn't take long. The backlash arrived like a wave with no shoreline. Editorials flooded in from coast to coast. An open letter was published by 20 civil rights organizations demanding Sky High's board suspend all leadership involved and adopt the protocol immediately. Shareholders started pulling out. 2 partnerships were terminated by international affiliates citing ethical concerns. On TV, financial analysts debated not if the airline would recover, but how long it could bleed before it collapsed. Dean sat in his office, red-eyed, staring at a flickering screen of collapsing stock prices. The chairman of the board had called 3 times. He didn't answer. Instead, he replayed the video again, the moment Amanda Crowley approached Nathaniel in seat 1A, the calmness, the restraint, the grace. And then he heard his own voice in his head. Let's not overdo the inclusion stuff. He closed his laptop and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, forehead resting in his palms. It wasn't about Nathaniel anymore. It was about what Nathaniel revealed. A company willing to silence accountability to preserve comfort. A CEO who thought quiet prejudice would remain hidden because the world wouldn't look too closely. Now the world was looking, and they weren't blinking. Across town, in the back room of a modest church repurposed for community meetings, Nathaniel stood before a circle of students and young professionals. They'd asked him to speak on leadership. He hadn't planned to accept, but something in him said now was the time. He didn't stand behind a podium. He stood with them at their level. You know what no one teaches you when you're building something? He paused. That sometimes you'll be the only one in the room who can see the fire before it burns through the floor. Someone raised their hand. Did you ever think about walking away all the time? Nathaniel said, especially when people tell you the way things are isn't your business to change. He looked around the room. But the seat you're in doesn't mean much if you never ask who's not being allowed to sit beside you. There was silence. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the room filled with applause, but Nathaniel didn't raise his hands. He didn't bow. He just nodded the same quiet way he had on that flight when Amanda told him he didn't belong. Because the moment wasn't about praise. It was about proof. Proof that something had shifted. And there was no going back. At Sky High headquarters, Amanda Crowley sat in the HR office, hands folded tightly in her lap. The video had ruined her. She couldn't walk through an airport without someone pointing. Her inbox was flooded. Threats, blame, even support, but not enough to matter. The HR officer didn't look at her with sympathy. Just policy. We're placing you on indefinite suspension pending investigation. Your union rep has been notified. Amanda opened her mouth to speak, but there were no words. She left the office, her steps hollow. The corridors were quiet now. Too quiet, like the silence before a building falls. That night, Isabel watched the news alone in her apartment. The anchor's voice filled the room. Sky High Airlines stock dropped another 12% today, following the release of internal emails that appear to show deliberate deactivation of a protocol meant to protect passengers from discrimination. CEO Dean Whitmore has not issued a personal statement. Pressure is mounting from shareholders for leadership accountability. Isabel muted the screen. She looked at her phone. A message blinked from Nathaniel. You made the difference. She stared at it for a moment, then typed back. No, you gave people a reason to look. I just turned the lights on. The boardroom was unusually quiet. Not the productive kind of quiet, where minds turn and strategies build. This silence was heavy, resigned, tense with anticipation of something unraveling fast. Dean Whitmore sat at the head of the table, but he didn't look like the man who had occupied that chair for over a decade. His blazer was draped over the back of the chair behind him. His shirt sleeves were wrinkled. His collar was open. And for once, he didn't look in control. The board members sat in a semicircle. Some took notes. Some watched him. One or two couldn't meet his eyes at all. Dean tried to speak first, to reclaim the air. We're prepared to issue a formal apology today. I've spoken to comms. It'll be authentic, transparent. We'll admit the failure, own the consequences. A woman cleared her throat at the end of the table. Judith Sanderson, the board's vice chair, sharp, composed, and until this week, one of Dean's quietest allies. It's too late for transparency, she said. The truth didn't come from us. It came from a man we tried to discredit and a protocol you buried. Dean opened his mouth, but she continued. This isn't about one flight. Dean, it's about a culture of insulation. You treated accountability like it was optional. Another board member spoke. Our public confidence index dropped by 42% in 2 days. We've lost 3 major corporate partnerships. Investors are asking if we're even salvageable. Dean's voice cracked slightly. This is still recoverable. If we pivot, take ownership. A man across from him interrupted. What do you think Nathaniel Cross would say? To that Dean didn't answer. He didn't have to. The boardroom's main screen flickered on. Colleen McAdams was on the news again. The anchor's voice narrated over a montage of public protests, shareholder exits, and angry customer testimonials. The ticker below the image read, Sky High Airlines on the brink. Will the CEO take responsibility? Judith looked straight at Dean. The question isn't whether you'll resign, it's whether you'll do it before the next headline writes itself. He lowered his eyes. How long do I have? She didn't blink. 6 hours. After that, the board votes. Dean stood slowly. He reached for his blazer, but paused before putting it on. For what it's worth, he said, I didn't think it would get this big. That's exactly the problem. Judith replied. Dean left the room. No one followed him. That same morning, Nathaniel Cross stood in his home office, reviewing emails on his tablet while sipping tea. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even relieved. He was just quiet, not silent, but still. The kind of still that comes after years of speaking up only to be dismissed. The kind that settles in your bones when the world finally catches up to what you've been saying all along. His phone buzzed. An email marked, Urgent, Subject Request for Private Meeting, Sky High Board of Directors. Nathaniel opened it. It was short and respectful. The board formally invites you to a closed-door meeting to discuss a path forward. Your presence is not mandatory, but would be welcomed. He set the tablet down and leaned back in his chair. They weren't just trying to save the company now. They were inviting the man they'd once removed to help rebuild what they broke. Part of him wanted to decline. Let them sit in the fire they had ignited. But another part of him, the part that still believed systems could change, said otherwise. He sent a short reply. I'll be there. When he arrived at Sky High headquarters later that afternoon, the atmosphere was different. The receptionist stood up when he walked in, not out of obligation, out of recognition. Mr. Cross, she said softly, they're waiting for you. He gave a polite nod. The elevator ride was quiet. Nathaniel stared at his reflection in the chrome walls. He wore a navy blue suit, pressed but not flashy. His posture was steady, eyes sharp but kind. When the elevator doors opened, Judith Sanderson was waiting. Thank you for coming. Mr. Cross, she said, extending her hand. He shook it without hesitation. Inside the boardroom, there were fewer people than usual. Some chairs were empty metaphorically and literally. Judith gestured to the seat at the end of the table. This time, it was offered without resistance. Nathaniel sat. Judith opened the meeting. "We owe you more than an apology. We owe you acknowledgement, and perhaps a chance if you're willing to shape the path ahead." He studied her. "What do you mean?" She slid a folder across the table. "We want to adopt the bias override protocol fully, not just as a PR fix, but as company standard. We want your team to oversee its integration." He opened the folder. Inside were documents with real changes, budgets reallocated, implementation roadmaps, training programs. "You're offering more than policy," Nathaniel said. "You're offering accountability." Judith nodded. "And a seat on our Ethics Oversight Committee." He smiled faintly. "Let me be clear. I didn't come here to save you. I came to make sure no one else has to go through what I did quietly, invisibly, and alone." She met his gaze. "That's exactly why we're asking." Nathaniel closed the folder gently. "Then, let's begin." Later that night, as the city lights shimmered in the distance, Nathaniel stood on his balcony, the wind rustling the trees below. He looked up at the stars, then back down at his phone. A text from Isabel had come in. "They're updating the system. The protocol is going live tonight. No more silent overrides, no more loopholes." He replied simply, "Good. Let's keep going." Isabel Tran had never been the kind of person people noticed in meetings. She was soft-spoken, always early, always prepared, but she rarely spoke unless called on. Most of her colleagues assumed she preferred to stay in the background. They were wrong. She had simply been waiting for the right moment. And now, her name was quietly making its way through every office at Sky High Airlines. After the internal emails leaked, reporters began reaching out, not just to corporate spokespeople, but to lower-level employees, engineers, schedulers, analysts, people like Isabel. Most stayed silent, but Isabel didn't. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't go live on any social media platforms. Instead, she wrote an open letter. She didn't sign it with her name at first, just a title, "A Systems Analyst Speaks." She posted it on her personal blog, then shared it with a few online groups focused on ethics in technology. It took less than 12 hours for it to go viral. In the letter, she described what it felt like to see injustice coded into systems, what it meant to find the bias override protocol deactivated not due to technical error, but because someone chose convenience over conscience. She wrote about Nathaniel, about how he didn't demand a spotlight, just a fair seat, how his silence on that flight spoke louder than all the announcements over the intercom. She ended the letter with a line that pierced through the noise. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. The quote spread like wildfire. People printed it on posters. It was shared in classrooms. It appeared in LinkedIn posts by diversity consultants, teachers, and activists. Even some small businesses printed it on shirts and mugs. Someone eventually traced the blog back to her. By then, it didn't matter. She had already become something more than anonymous. She had become a voice. It's all I know. Inside the office, things changed. HR no longer avoided her desk. Comms asked her to consult on a campaign about ethics and rebuilding trust. And for the first time since joining Sky High, she was invited to a leadership town hall, not to listen, but to speak. She stood in front of 200 employees, knees trembling slightly, fingers tight on the microphone. But when she opened her mouth, her voice didn't waver. There's a reason systems fail. She began. It's not just the people at the top. It's the silence in the middle. People like me, people who see the problem and convince themselves it's not their place to speak. She scanned the crowd. I almost stayed silent. I almost let fear convince me that nothing I did would matter. She took a breath. But one man didn't move from his seat. And because he stayed seated, the rest of us stood up. The applause was thunderous. Later, someone slipped her a note folded in half. "Thank you. I've been waiting for someone to say that for years. See, a dispatch." She kept the note in her wallet. Meanwhile, at Crosswell Capital, Nathaniel received an email from a nonprofit education organization. They had started a mentorship program called Stand Firm, inspired by the Seat 1A incident, focused on training young people of color in leadership, ethics, and technology. They wanted Isabel to be their first keynote speaker. Nathaniel forwarded the email to her. She hesitated before replying. "I'm not sure I'm that kind of person," she wrote. He responded almost instantly. "You are? You just didn't know it yet." The event was small but powerful. 50 students in folding chairs, eyes wide and full of questions. Isabel told them the full story from the moment she first opened that buried protocol to the day she stood in front of Sky High's leadership and said, "No more hiding." She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She just told the truth. Afterward, one of the students, a teenage girl with long braids and fierce eyes, came up to her. "I want to be in tech, but I'm scared. My teacher says I'm too sensitive for that world." Isabel smiled. Sensitivity isn't a weakness, it's a signal. It tells you when something's wrong. Don't shut it off. Use it to build something better. The girl nodded, visibly moved. That night, Isabel walked home feeling lighter than she had in months, not because the battle was over, but because she had found her place in it. A week later, Nathaniel sat in a quiet lounge in O'Hare International, waiting for his flight to D.C. He wore a gray blazer, no tie, relaxed. A staff member approached, hesitant. "Mr. Cross." He looked up. "Yes." She smiled nervously. "We just wanted to say we're glad you're flying with us again, and that things are different now because of you." Nathaniel nodded gently. "They're different because people decided not to look away." She smiled and handed him his boarding pass. 1A. He looked at it for a moment, then tucked it into his pocket. Nathaniel Cross stepped onto the jet bridge with a slow, measured stride. It was the first time he had flown since the incident, or as some were now calling it, the Seat 1A stand. He didn't like the name. He hadn't stood at all. He had stayed seated, calm, firm, silent. That had been the point. Today's flight was to Washington, D.C., a private conference with airline executives, civil rights leaders, and regulators awaited him. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about meetings. He was thinking about what it meant to walk this path again, back onto a plane, the very place where this all began. The flight crew welcomed him aboard with sincere eyes. Not performative, not nervous, just aware. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cross," the pilot said, stepping forward from the cockpit. "We're honored to have you with us today." Nathaniel nodded. He appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't here for ceremony. He walked toward first class. The cabin was bright, warm. Subtle changes had been made not obvious to the casual eye, but Nathaniel noticed them. He noticed the diversity among the crew. He noticed the way the gate agent had handled each boarding group with care, even greeting passengers by name. But what struck him most was the small engraved placard on the side of Seat 1A. He paused when he saw it. A brushed steel plate with a short inscription, "Let dignity take its seat," dedicated to the moment that reminded us why we fly better together. He didn't touch it. He simply sat down. Across the aisle, an elderly woman leaned over. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Are you the man from the article?" He turned to her gently. "Yes, ma'am." She smiled warmly. Well, it's about time someone reminded these companies who's paying for the wings. He laughed, a quiet, easy sound. The seat didn't feel like a battleground anymore. It felt earned. Still. Nathaniel's mind wandered. He thought of Isabel, of her quiet bravery, her open letter, her speech at the town hall. He thought of Dean Whitmore. Word had spread that Dean had officially resigned. No press conference, no fanfare. Just a short statement, "I failed to listen when it mattered most." He thought of Amanda Crowley, the flight attendant. Last he heard, she had begun attending workplace equity training, not court-mandated, but voluntary. That, in its own way, was a kind of growth. He looked out the window as the plane began taxiing. Runways stretched like ribbons ahead of them. Sunlight poured in. Nathaniel had spent most of his life solving problems quietly. In boardrooms, behind spreadsheets, within contracts. But this had never been about numbers. This had been about visibility, about the invisible assumptions baked into institutions until one moment forced everyone to look up and ask why. As the plane lifted into the air, Nathaniel felt the tension in his shoulders release. Not all of it, but some. He was returning to D.C., not as a passenger with a grievance, but as a policy advisor. Crosswell Capital had been invited to help craft a federal transportation equity framework, and Nathaniel would lead the ethics subcommittee. That alone said everything. He pulled out his tablet and opened the draft proposal. At the top of the document, Bias Override Protocol National Model Draft. He smiled faintly. This wasn't just about fixing one airline. It was about rewriting the flight plan for everyone. 3 hours later, as the plane landed at Reagan National Airport, Nathaniel collected his briefcase and nodded goodbye to the crew. No press waited for him, no flashbulbs, just a car, a schedule, and purpose. Outside the terminal, a woman approached him cautiously. "Mr. Cross." "Yes." She held up a notebook. "My son's in tech. He read about your story. Said you made him feel like he belonged in rooms he's never even seen." Nathaniel paused. "Tell him he already belongs. He just hasn't walked through the door yet." She nodded, her eyes glassy with emotion. "Thank you for not letting them take your seat." He offered a quiet smile. It was never about the seat. It was about the message sitting in it. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Isabel Tran sat in her small apartment, organizing a virtual panel discussion on ethics in artificial intelligence and transportation systems. She had recently accepted a part-time role at Crosswell Capital while still consulting for Sky High. She didn't need a spotlight. She had found something better, purpose, and a community. She glanced at her phone, another email from a student who had seen her talk. "Miss Tran, I didn't think people like me could make noise without shouting. You showed me we can—" Isabel closed the message, her heart full. She returned to her panel notes. Title of the session, "Staying in Your Seat." The Power of Principled Resistance. It was perfect. The next day, Sky High Airlines released a video on all major platforms. No actors, no scripts, just real employees reading real letters from customers. Then came the final frame, Nathaniel's quote, printed on the screen in white letters against a black background. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. And beneath it, a new corporate pledge, Bias Override Protocol. Now live across all flights, Sky High Airlines accountability, not apology. The return flight was quiet. Nathaniel Cross sat once again in seat 1A. the familiar hum of the aircraft filling the space around him. But the energy was different this time. No unease, no sidelong glances, just peace. The flight attendant approached, a young man in his 20s, confident but respectful. "Mr. Cross, would you like anything to drink before takeoff? Water will do." "Thank you." The young man returned moments later, placing the glass down with a smile. "I've been meaning to say, what you did changed everything for some of us. I used to hide who I was. Now, I lead the crew's DEI committee. We even got approval to start peer mentorship." Nathaniel offered a calm, knowing smile. "I'm glad the flight is going somewhere better." The attendant nodded and stepped away. Nathaniel looked out the window, watching the tarmac roll by. The sunlight caught on the wing, and in that moment, he remembered something his mother once told him when he was just a boy sitting by the window of a Greyhound bus, watching the world blur past. Sometimes staying still is the loudest thing you can do. He had always thought she meant that as a metaphor. Now, he realized she meant it for life. When the plane lifted off the ground, there was no turbulence. The ascent was smooth. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Back in Chicago, the city was preparing for an upcoming ceremony, a community event to honor changemakers in transportation equity. The organizers had insisted Nathaniel be recognized, but he had quietly declined a headline spot. Instead, he nominated Isabel Tran to speak. She was nervous. But when she walked onto the stage at the Southside Civic Center, the crowd greeted her like someone they already knew. Someone who had done something rare, acted without ego, without demand, and without ever asking for the spotlight. She stood at the podium, her voice strong now, more certain than ever. The systems we live in are only as fair as the people maintaining them. And the truth is, too often, we're taught to think that fixing the system isn't our job, that someone else, someone higher, someone louder will take care of it. She looked out across the audience. Families, students, airline staff, policymakers. But sometimes the change starts with a single decision: to speak, to log in, to open a file, to say, "No, this isn't right." The audience was silent, hanging on her words. We all think we're too small to matter, but small actions are how mountains begin to shift. I wasn't trying to go viral. I was trying to do the right thing, and I'm not alone anymore. The applause filled the room. Someone in the front row wiped away tears. Later that evening, Nathaniel received a short video message on his phone. It was from Isabel, filmed after the event. She held up the engraved placard from Seat 1A. They retired it today. She said they're sending it to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You're officially part of history, Nathaniel. He smiled, touched, but also humbled. The plaque didn't matter to him. What mattered was that someone somewhere would read that inscription one day and remember what it meant. 1 week later, Sky High Airlines published a full transparency report, the first in its history. It included not only data on past seating overrides, but also detailed plans to implement quarterly audits, anonymous staff reporting, and partnerships with external equity firms. At the top of the report was a message to our passengers, past, present, and future. We are listening. We are learning. We are changing. Signed at the bottom was the new CEO, Judith Sanderson. She had asked Nathaniel to review the report before it went public. He made only one note in the margin: "Don't forget who still isn't seated." The movement didn't stop with one airline. Other companies began to adopt similar protocols: bus systems, rideshare platforms, ticketing algorithms for concerts and events. The ripple effect was real. And it all traced back to a quiet man in a first-class seat who refused to move. One afternoon, Nathaniel visited a middle school in Bronzeville. A teacher had invited him to speak to her 8th grade class. She said her students had followed his story and wanted to know what came next. When he entered the classroom, every student stood up and clapped. He laughed gently and waved them back into their seats. One boy, about 13, raised his hand immediately. Mr. Cross. Were you scared? Nathaniel thought for a moment. Yes, I was, but not of the flight crew, not of what people would say. He paused. I was scared that if I didn't say something, someone else would go through what I did, and they might not be as lucky. The boy nodded seriously. Another student raised her hand. What should we do when we see something unfair? Nathaniel smiled. You don't have to shout. You don't have to fight. But don't look away. Looking away is how systems survive. The students clapped again, louder this time. Before he left, the teacher handed him a card, handmade and signed by every student. Thank you for staying in your seat, it said. That night, Nathaniel sat at his dining room table, watching the city glow outside the window. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't want to. He just felt full of purpose, of quiet victory, of proof that a person didn't have to raise their voice to change the conversation. Sometimes the power was in the stillness. Sometimes it was in the seat. And sometimes when the world finally listened, it was in the echo left behind. He didn't sue. He didn't scream. He didn't seek revenge. Instead, Nathaniel Cross gave the world something it didn't expect: accountability with grace. One quiet act on one ordinary flight exposed a pattern millions had experienced, but no one had seen. And in staying seated, he helped a generation rise. From corporate boardrooms to middle school classrooms, his story inspired not just outrage, but action. A young analyst found her voice. A little girl saw her future. And an industry was forced to ask itself, who are we letting in? And who are we pushing out? This wasn't just about race. It was about recognition, about what happens when we look away, and what's possible when we finally choose to see. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to move. If this story touched you, if it made you think, reflect, or feel something stir inside, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing stories that matter to people who care. And remember, one seat can hold a story. One story can change everything. See you in the next episode.